Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willies, your host. Today, we're honored to have in the house with us David Vernon, Professor David Vernon. He's an adjunct professor of philosophy at St. Thomas University, Miami Gardens, and Miami-Dade College. Today, we are going to discuss some quite interesting subjects. Specifically, we're going to discuss fascism. David, welcome to Politics Done Right. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me on, sir.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. I just think that, talking about fascism is quite important right now, giving its media coverage. While there is still a lot of skepticism about American fascism, I want to, dispel certain skepticisms, not like as a yay sort of thing, but in the most unfortunate sense. So I use my position as a philosopher to talk about the emergence of ideas in our contemporary time.
Well, let's start first with the true definition of fascism. How do you define fascism?
So I define fascism based upon how Benito Mussolini wrote about it, the individual who formulated the idea of fascism. And if you read his text, The Doctrine of Fascism, the best way you can pull a definition out of that, it is hyper-nationalism or ultra-nationalism by any means necessary.
And when you say by any means necessary, meaning both from the governmental point of view as well as from the corporate point of view?
Yeah, anything. It is also mentioned towards the end of the Doctrine of Fascism that for the fascist, both imperialism and non-imperialism is valid. So we're talking any means necessary, truths, lies, governments, corporations, invasion, non-invasion, anything is up for sale as long as it, quote unquote, benefits the nation.
I think that is important because I think what you're actually saying as well, and tell me if I'm reading you right, is that the economic system doesn't matter. It's whatever works. The social justice system doesn't matter. Whatever works. No matter what, the fascism can fall under any particular economic or socioeconomic system that you so choose.
It could. It just so happens that historically it has always fallen under capitalist systems, right? And that's not necessarily an accident because there are some benefits offered by the capitalist system, such as mass resource production. And fascists tend to like to be imperialists. And so having mass resource production is useful for war. So it isn't a accident that fascism has always found itself under capitalist systems. However, it is not a necessary function of capitalism. In theory, you could, have a fascist social democracy is certainly something that is not impossible, but hasn't been seen yet.
Well, interestingly, I can understand why it's also easy under capitalism, because while we are usually sold a bag of fallacies that capitalism is dependent on democracy, the fact is that the core of capitalism, which is the corporation proper, is one of the furthest things away from democracy, something that I actually call the fermenters of antiseptic slavery. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally a social democrat, so I do see the very obvious problems with like full laissez-faire capitalism and how it's not necessarily a democratic system. So yeah, it is definitely one of those things where you cannot have pure capitalism, just unrelenting and, in a sense, unchecked. And so in this sense, though, right, what fascism does, it'll want to make as many tools as possible at its disposal unchecked so it can go about its national competitive advantages. And those national competitive advantages are, having one's nation rank above all others at all costs.
Now, one nation ranked over others. Now, we hear Donald Trump always talking about America first, America first, America first. Now, it also seems to me like for a successful fascist state, and notice I didn't say a fascist state, I said a successful fascist state to exist, you also need a competent fascist leader, something that it seems Donald Trump is failing miserably at. So help me out there.
Not necessarily. I mean, fascism always comes with a level of incompetency because it cares about loyalty. As Benito Mussolini writes, the nation is not the majority. A really good example of this is Batista in Cuba,
Hmm.
right? In Batista's regime, right, he hired a lot of loyalists, and a lot of these loyalists were, well, morons, right? They were just kind of like strong men, morons and bullies, right? They weren't necessarily the best people for any given job. And the thing that kept Batista's, power going is that the U.S. was complicit. It wasn't like, yay, we're happy that he's here. John F. Kennedy spoke against him, but it was still like not enough of a problem. And so in this, though, right, we actually do see a lot of incompetencies in fascism. Yes, there are individuals who partake in fascism that are unfortunately intelligent and help in that regard. We can see this in many individuals in Adolf Hitler circles, despite being weird cultists. Many of them were quite competent generals and economic administrators. And so, yeah, fascism doesn't have to be competent to even be successful.
Let me hit the point again because I agree with everything that you've said. I don't know if you necessarily see where I was going with my question, and that was, I think Mussolini was a very competent guy. Now, the people that become loyalists, inherent to become a cultist or a loyalist means that you have to have some level of incompetency because, again, you don't have faith in yourself to be able to be just this type of loyalist. We can also look at, let's say, look at Hitler. And it's dangerous anytime you're talking about Hitler, but I think Hitler was a fairly competent guy. I think if he had made certain moves, we may be living in extended Germany right now, but he just kind of bit off too more than he could take too fast. And correct me if you see a flaw in that in
Yeah,
what I
well,
just
rather
said.
than going about historical speculation, the question here is, okay, how can American contemporary fascism be successful when its strongman is such a bumbling fool?
Thank you for thank you for saying that because I think you got to the core of where I wanted to go. So thank you. That is exactly right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so successful fascism is not necessarily about, any sort of competency in regards to being a manager or a good statesman. It's literally about procuring as much power as possible and using anything as a bludgeon, right? You'll see Trump be both pro-war and anti-war, right, in the same day, even, right? So it's about disposing anything that you can towards your ends, towards your ambitions, towards your collection of power into the state, which often results, especially with fascism, into powers being collected into one individual who symbolically represents the nation. Trump representing America, Mussolini representing Italy, Trujillo representing the Dominican Republic.
Republic, yeah. Trujillo, let's not talk about Trujillo. He was terrible, especially in the way he treated the Haitians. But yeah. So let's go ahead and tell me the steps that you see we've taken thus far on the path to fascism.
Well, the steps are the hyper nationalist narrative taking over,
Now,
right?
when did that start? I mean, and my question is, did that start under Trump specifically, or did we have different iterations of this throughout our history?
I mean, there was an emergence of American fascist ideas right before the Second World War. So it's not like this is brand new in American history. However, that movement was not very successful, whereas this movement has been successful. And I think rather than putting a timeline on these things, right, because, that could be put up for debate, the point at hand is we have crossed that Rubicon, right? We have, the America First rhetoric. We have the Make America Great Again, which creates the ostracization of others, right? A reformulation of the nation and its espoused greatness, right? You have individuals who are in favor of invading Greenland and the Panama Canal and Gaza, these sorts of actions where it's like, hey, your nation does not matter, right? What we want to do is what goes. So rather than worrying about a timeline, it's like we're here, the Rubicon is crossed, and you can see the fascist rhetoric exists not just within the halls of power, but on Twitter and YouTube comments and so on of the sort.
Now, you have to have, for you to be completely successful, you have to have a complicit military. Donald Trump has changed a whole lot of military folks on the top brass, and he has changed. Again, of course, we got one of the most incompetent defense secretaries in Hegseth. I don't, I should ask you, do you think, as far as the military brass is concerned, the part that's which is the largest part that Donald Trump doesn't yet control, do you think they would take orders to go against the community if necessary, the populace if necessary?
At the end of the day, I cannot speculate on individuals' personal psychology, but obviously it is worrying when that sort of rhetoric even comes up, right? Where you have, during the Black Lives Matter protests, right, where you even have him even hinting at the idea of shooting protesters in the leg, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is, the type of rhetoric that could go downhill, especially when you have about 25% of Americans with full certainty on board. And so the concern at hand is I cannot read someone's psychology, but the more these rhetorics get put out and the more people take on to them, the more likely that a loyal arm of individuals who enact physical power will be used by Trump. And rather than worrying about the military, which is a big concern, we can also see the clear and present danger with ICE being used like a Gestapo.
Now, right now the courts are coming back on that. Do you think, based on what you're saying, do you think that likely Trump will in fact disregard the courts as they continue to rule against what he's doing with the Gestapo?
Well, he has cited verbally multiple times a fondness for Andrew Jackson. And one of the most famous things that Andrew Jackson said is that the court has made its ruling, now enforce it. And so I'm not sure how historically knowledgeable Trump is or isn't, but certainly he's kind of following that model with the Supreme Court being like, hey, they don't have a enforcement mechanism. Meanwhile, right, like I have Kristi Noem with DHS and I have my own personal, wannabe Gestapo, if not already there. And meanwhile, the Supreme Court has 9 people in robes.
Now, we had looked at the Constitution with its separation of powers as pretty ingenious and pretty good. I always thought that the Constitution had some very severe flaws. Specifically, it's a capital document and not a total humane document. Is there anything that can be done? Because that statement that Andrew Jackson talked about or mentioned that now enforce your rule, it's concerning because it's right. There's no mechanism within the Constitution for the Supreme Court to enforce its rulings.
Yeah, I mean, all Republican systems of government exist in part due to norms. We can see this with the Venetian Republic, which gave way to oligarchy. We can see this with the Roman Empire, which gave way to imperial dictatorship due to corruption with the literal position of dictator in the Roman Empire. And so in this, right, like you have very smart people, come together, make a useful document, a document that has room for progress and change. But, there's human fallibility no matter how smart everyone in the room is. And so the concern at hand in regards to kind of counteracting an individual who does not want to follow norms and customs is other people making sure that their feet are held to the fire. And we had plenty of opportunities for this to happen with Trump, right? Like even an impeachment post January 6th would have been a very strong example, right? And also disallowing him from running because he participated in an act of treason. But there was a lot of fear about, right-wing individuals committing violence and rising in the streets, which makes a lot of sense, especially after January 6th, where there was literally an instance of right-wing violence and threats, including, a gallows rope outside of the Congress building for the then vice president.
Now, so in that light, how reversible? Because I still think we're very reversible. my opinion, I don't know what you think. How reversible are we from how far we've crossed the Rubicon?
Well, I think the problem with crossing the Rubicon is you can never go back, right? So there will always be changes as a result. Once an idea enters the zeitgeist, it doesn't really disappear ever. It may not hold as much popularity or as much sway, but like ideas don't really get burnt out, right? It doesn't matter how many, well, book burnings there are, funny enough, right? The ideas and the notions still exist. The narrative still exists. It's very hard to fully erase history and actions. And so, in that sort of sense, right, there is going to be a large population of Americans for a long time coming that will hold on to American fascist viewpoints, praise for Trump, and be okay with American blatant imperialism and blatant anti-immigration sentiments and et cetera, anti-trans sentiments and et cetera of that sort.
It's interesting because that you say that, because it goes as bad as to say that there are some people now in the right wing that's been talking about bringing back the institution of slavery as not a bad thing and not a wrong thing. So, I mean, that gives credence to a lot of what you said, that once it gets into the zeitgeist, that it is hard as hell to get out. And that has been over, several hundred years now, and it's still a possibility.
Yeah, and this isn't just an American thing. Like, we can see this with how Japan fails to properly talk about the rape of Nanking, right? And so at the end of the day here, one of the kind of downsides of, ideas getting into the zeitgeist is that, yes, free expression is more important than being like, oh, we need to police every idea, because then that creates a 1984 slippery slope. But again, the danger of free speech is the emergence of ideas. And let's be real, right? Fascists don't care about free speech, right? They put the whole facts care about your feelings, the cancel culture, right? And they're try to dominate the language of free speech to ultimately turn around and go, oh, you want to talk against, the nation state of Israel. Oh, you want to talk badly about our president. Bam. Right. And so fascists are very postmodern in their tactic, meaning that they do have a true narrative, right? They believe in hyper-nationalism. But aside from that, they'll just throw any narrative into the wind. They'll throw any idea into the wind to funnel anyone towards their cause of hyper-nationalism, right? They'll try to get people on trans issues, economic issues, America, F yeah, in that Matt Stone, Trey Parker type way. Any tool at the disposal will be used to pipeline towards hyper-nationalism.
Well, David, two things. One more question, and then the first one is, where do we go from here? How do we close this baby out? And the other question is, what should I have asked you that I didn't ask you? And answer them in whichever order you prefer.
So I think what can be done is a genuine counter narrative against fascism and a willingness to be postmodern, right? A lot of times leftist ideas are very hyper rational, which there is room for hyper rationality. However, right, there's been this disattachment from feelings and other narratives, and so it's not about giving into the necessarily the things that fascists want or act, right? Because you see a lot of that, unfortunately, happening, compromise with fascism. Rather, it's being like, well, that's stupid, that's weird, that's dumb, right? So this openness about calling it out. Is that necessarily going to change anything? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the point at hand being, I think it's important when fascism emerges anywhere, right? Just as any horrible extremism emerges anywhere, give it a middle finger. So, and that could implement change or that could not. But I think it's important to,
to face
for
it.
one's personal value. Yeah, to both face it for both one's personal values and for the potentiality of change.
And now, what would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't?
Honestly, at the end of the day, there is no things that necessarily need to be asked. I think the only thing that's important to pay attention to is propaganda, rhetoric, changing ideas, right? Like we can see a strong example of this being anti-immigration, but all of a sudden, right, oh, we need to let the Afrikaners in, right? Oh, pulling specific clips from the EFF, right, without giving the context. So I think the important thing in general, whether you're left, you're right, you're center, you're this way. Be careful about dogma, right? Always investigate, double check ideas, look at perspectives, because if you don't, right, there is a single rhetoric that takes over, and we can see the harmful effects of that with emergent fascism.
David Vernon, adjunct professor of philosophy at St. Thomas University, Miami Gardens, and Miami-Dade College. Thank you so kindly for having been on
Thank
Politics
you for having
Done
me,
Right.
sir.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.